Hi, everybody. Thank you very much, John. Thank you all. Please continue to eat while I talk. I guess I'll just do a little self-introduction here. I joined World Wildlife about 6 months ago, and prior to that, I worked with the United Nations. I lived over in Rome for about 6 years. I worked with the Food and Agriculture Organization there. I was a specialist in enforcement there. That's basically my background. I'm an attorney by training. And prior to moving to Rome, I worked with NOAA and the U.S. Department of Justice and the court system. So lots of law in my background. But what I'm here to talk to you about today actually is a continuation of that theme. Here we're going to today talk about illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. What is it, why it matters, how it may be impacting folks here in the United States. I thought I would just give you a little bit of context to understand sort of the state of basically the world's fisheries. How are they doing? Do we need to be worried about them? Short answer, yes, very much so. This is data from my former employer, UN, and all of the countries provide their own data, so they're one of the few places where you can get a comprehensive world picture. I hope I'm going to hit the right button. Okay, so this blue, the dark blue segment here, this is basically the majority of the world's fisheries, but those are basically at maximum exploitation, so they need to be watched carefully so they don't lapse over into this area. Over a full 30% of the fisheries that are occurring in the world are in this group, and this segment of the pie has been growing. So this is really where I think we are very concerned, and especially if you look at these two together, more than 85% of the fisheries around the world are not managed particularly well and are not fished appropriately. What are some of the other trends that are impacting this? Rapid globalization of the markets. That basically just means the technology that contributes to the vessels that go out to catch the boats, the gear that's used to take the fish out of the water, the transport mechanisms. The fact is that basically we can be eating something on our plates that came out of the water from around the world yesterday. The transport systems are particularly good. They're looking to go faster and faster all the time. And one of the things that's also very much in play is the consumption of fish is increasing. Part of this is affluence around the world in general. As countries become richer, they want to diversify their diets, more protein. That usually means more fish. And I don't know if you know this, but basically in the United States, we import 91% of the fish that comes into our country. Very high percentage. That too has grown very significantly. How does that compare to how much fish we eat? Well, we're actually on average consuming about 16 pounds of fish a year per capita here in the United States. Worldwide, much higher. We're not even though we eat a large volume of fish, comparatively speaking, there are many countries where the per capita consumption is much higher. Some island states like the Maldives, they're eating more than 200 kilos of fish per person a year. World average is about 19 kilos per year, so we're not so high. But because we're a large market, we're relatively well off. We are depending on whose numbers you look at, the second largest consumer of fish products in the world. Some will say it's EU, some say Japan. Anyway, we're up and we're consuming a very large quantity of fish. Most of the fish that enters international commerce, where is it coming from? Oftentimes it's coming from the waters of developing countries. Many developing countries don't have particularly well-developed systems for managing their fisheries or for enforcement. So what I wanted to talk to you just a little bit about today is this concept of IUU. I put up the international definition. I know that the definition in the Magnuson Act is a little bit different. These are found in internationally accepted both treaties and voluntary instruments. They're a little bit broader than what you see in Magnuson. The first is basically the I, and it's looking at fishing in contraventions of laws, what you would think the word illegal means, regulations of a country or an international agreement. So that means under this definition that illegal fishing can occur within the national waters of a country, within that 200-mile zone where the country exercises jurisdiction. Second thing, misreporting. To me, misreporting basically is a subset basically of illegal, because If there's a requirement to report the data you've got and you're not reporting it, or you're reporting it as something else, basically you're doing something you're not supposed to. And the last is a category we don't look at that often, and that's basically the unregulated category. And that's just generally fishing in a way that undermines sort of the general principles that a lot of the conservation requirements are trying to achieve. Where does IUU fishing occur? That's not to say that it doesn't occur everywhere, because basically it does occur everywhere. It occurs in varying degrees in almost every fishery around the world. The relative size of the dots here, you'll see basically, sorry, that was supposed to be see if I can make that a little clearer for you. You see that at least sort of, in the tropical waters, sort of in the equatorial zones, this is where you see the concentration of the largest dots, in addition to here, basically in Asia. And you see a lot down here, and these are probably primarily looking at a fish that maybe you've seen before. It's called Patagonian toothfish, although usually it shows up on restaurant and catering menus as Chilean sea bass. And this was one of the sort of the darlings of the restaurant trade for a long time. It's a slow-growing fish. It lives in cold waters. You sort of fish it along the coast, basically, of Antarctica. It was one of the most valuable commercial fisheries around. I mean, I know that Mike's going to talk to you in a few minutes about tuna, but basically there were large vessels fishing this stuff. These waters are very, very rough, some of the most difficult in the world. And it was understood that on a single voyage you could make a profit of $1 million US. The fish was worth that much. So it garnered a lot of attention. These basically are lots of different species of fish. And you'll see also there's some dots along the US. I know that many people are surprised. They know that we're a relatively heavily regulated country, and they believe that we don't have illegal fishing going on in the United States. I used to run the enforcement program at NOAA. On average, we made about 600 to 800 new cases a year. We have a lot of things going on, but our fisheries are considered to be relatively well managed, and our enforcement programs were strong compared to what happens in a number of other countries, many of which are in these zones here, where the enforcement programs are relatively weak. What is the volume of what we're talking about? One of the few global studies that exist suggests that illegal fishing losses may be as much as 23 billion USD annually. My own feeling as a former prosecutor is that that is a gross underestimate of probably what really happens, and it doesn't account for any of the indirect losses that excessive overfishing results in. Because basically this study that came up with these numbers really looked at things that had been confirmed. And the reality is we don't catch all the bad guys. Nobody catches all the bad guys. And so a lot of what happens is it's not counted in these numbers. I think, hopefully have tried to show you that it is a global phenomenon. Fish is moving all around the world. A lot of enforcement systems are not very good. A lot of people who are inclined to break the law go to the weak places where enforcement is weak. They know where those are. The port facilities aren't bad. They could ship out of there. This next bullet, I'll just say fleet capacity continues to increase. There's a real tension in many of the developing countries between economic development and sustainable management. How do we protect our environment? How do we get our people's standard of living to rise? There's a lot of tension there, and oftentimes there's not necessarily easy, politically acceptable answers to a lot of those questions. Around the world, we have now about 4 million fishing vessels. That's a huge number. In fact, about 75 to 85% of them are here in Southeast Asia. So we have lots of areas where there's far too many fish chasing not enough, fishermen chasing not enough fish. And part of the problems are very much human in nature, in the sense that as countries, oftentimes we find it very difficult to readily share information about who's moving where, who's doing what, how quickly. How ready are we to take action to sort of deal with the complicated market change that exists today? Is there a lot of corruption in a number of countries? Yes, absolutely there is. That makes it even harder. So it's a very difficult thing. And I don't want to leave you thinking, oh my gosh, she's painted such a picture of gloom and doom here. There's no way out. These are some of the common problems: capacity, both in terms of human capacity. Do you have the people who are appropriately trained in the right places around the world to deal with some of these issues? Many developing countries, clearly the answer is no. Coordination, that was an issue I just talked about. Can we share information? Can we cooperate with each other even when we have the information? A lot of the folks who are doing this kind of work, and organized crime is very much a factor in moving illegal fisheries today. Fisheries are generally considered to be weakly regulated, so they're good vehicles for moving drugs, for moving firearms, for moving other types of contraband. You pick a big cargo container of fish, especially if it's fresh, first thing you're going to notice is the smell. So that masks an awful lot of other things, and it discourages a lot of inspectors from actually going deep and really seeing what's in the back of that container. Are there people back there? Are there drugs? Are there other things? Adequacy of resources. Even this government, which is one of the richest governments in the world, would tell you, at least from some areas, that they don't have enough resources. There's not enough money being put into enforcement, into training, into the sort of things that help try to stem the tide of some of this. And if we as the United States say that, you can only imagine what most of the rest of the countries around the world say. Real-time exchange of information, do we have a system for doing that? No, we don't. Nimbleness of IUU operators, well, I'll show you that slide in a minute. And market forces, in the sense that I think that they can be harnessed a lot more effectively than they are to be an agent for positive change. Okay, this slide is basically a screenshot to show you, if you were a vessel owner, how quickly you could change your national registration. You can go online, you can do this in less than 30 minutes, and you can do it for a couple $100s. It's now not called flagsofconvenience.com anymore. That seemed a little too brash. So they have changed their name. It's a company out of Cyprus, and it's not just for fishing vessels. It's for all sorts of different types of conveyances. But the reality is, you can do it, and you can do it cheaply, and you can do it without a lot of questions being asked of you. And this makes the enforcement picture that much more complicated. You're talking about fishing vessels out on the high seas. They're flagged to certain states. It's very difficult to engage those states to allow inspectors to get on those boats. You can't see what's on the boat. You're not going to know what's there. You don't know where they went, where they fished, did they have authority. When I was in the U.S. government, we apprehended a vessel in the Pacific, and they basically sort of gave us, like, here's a deck of cards. We have 26 different sets of national documentation. Pick one. Who do you want us to be today? That's how easy it is. It's really easy to do this. And this is not a problem exclusively in the fishing sector. There are certainly valid reasons why corporations want to limit their liability and locate in places that make it very easy. That has, that's not exclusive to fisheries, but it's one of the difficulties you have when you're trying to basically deal with this problem. The drivers, we've already talked about them a little bit. Money, opportunity, lack of deterrent. What happens out at sea is far away. It's hard to watch it. Can technology help? Yes. Is it helping? Yes. Is it pervasive enough? No. Is there a lot of money to be made? Profitability? Yes. You already know that. I gave you some pretty eye-popping statistics. Lack of deterrent, for the most part, penalties are low. They don't even cover cost of doing business if you end up in that situation, and opportunity for evading law enforcement is high. What are some of the things that, the impacts of this? Economic, biological, social. We already talked about some of the, we talked about some of the dollar figures, the losses. It certainly also contributes to loss of jobs and livelihoods. That's basically here as well as elsewhere. And I'm sure you've all read in the paper how many communities, especially in places like West Africa, with their coastal communities, they exist on subsistence fishing. When the fish are gone because people who didn't have authority to take them took them, the community economic structure collapses. A lot of the breadwinners then take very risky trips in small boats to try to get to a better life, and oftentimes those end very tragically. Obviously, there's damage to fish stocks from overfishing. The scientists tell us you're supposed to fish at certain levels. If you fish more than that, that can lead to fishery collapse. That's happened to our neighbors in the north. In the cod stocks in Canada, especially in the east, they still haven't recovered. And obviously in the Magnuson Act, we're looking to try to stem overfishing by a whole range of indicators. Undermines all aspects of fisheries management. Yeah, you don't know how much is being taken out. How can you manage? And certainly sometimes the type of gear, dynamiting, that doesn't usually happen here, but elsewhere in the world it does. All sorts of gear that destroys bottoms, that harms ecosystems in many ways, and then the social problems that result from here. Food insecurity, about 1 in 8 around the world are considered food insecure. Lots of problems between the small-scale folks and some of the big ones. Not everywhere. I don't mean to say that every single person that participates in fisheries, is completely ignoring what the requirements are, no. But certainly the IUU problems we have are driven by many of those folks. One of the solutions, and I know that Mike is going to talk about a few other things, but people are often interested, how can I be sure that what I'm buying isn't stolen? I don't want to eat a stolen tuna sandwich. Okay, how can I be sure that that's not what I'm buying? There is an organization, Marine Stewardship Council, that has set standards. They're working with about 300 fisheries around the world to try to make sure they're environmentally friendly and legal. And Whole Foods and a number of, without trying to sound like I'm pushing Whole Foods, there are a number of grocery chains in the area that stock products with this symbol on there. And I know I am out of time, so I will say thank you very much, and I welcome any questions you have later on.
Great, thank you, Michele. Thanks for coming out for this. It's a really important topic. There's a lot to understand, and I imagine probably everybody in the room has some varying degree of understanding about fisheries and the challenges we face. A little bit of background about myself. I used to be a television news reporter, and 5 years ago found myself really invested in tuna, which is something I never grew up thinking was going to happen for me. Would spend my life talking about tuna, but that's what I do with the International Seafood Sustainability Foundation. And you're going to find out why tuna is such an important commodity around the world. But if there are two things that I can leave you with when you walk out today, besides some good dessert, which I had nothing to do with, but it looks delicious, is that transparency is absolutely vital to the future of our fisheries, and transparency is key to sustainability. Michele talked a lot about IUU fishing. IUU fishing is a direct threat to sustainability of our fish stocks and the greater marine ecosystems in which they live. So if you can address issues of transparency, you can really move things along. And the other thought I'd like to leave you with is that simple steps really do matter. There are some really fundamental basic things that can be done, both at a markets level, but also at a government level and a management level that can really go a long way towards improving some of the challenges that we currently face. So conservation, I would say these days with ecosystem-based management of fisheries is really the goal of good management in any fishery, whether it be fisheries in the US or fisheries that are in the high seas like tuna. Conservation really is key. Good management is a conservation of the resource, so it is there for future generations. It's there for the fishermen, it's there for the industry, it's there for the marine ecosystem. Conservation is really key. In order to get conservation, you have to know who is fishing. Like Michele said, there's a lot of vessels out there, and a lot of vessels means that there's a lot of room for the bad actors to kind of weasel their way in there and really corrupt the process. So you really have to have a dynamic understanding of who is on the water, who is fishing, where are they fishing, when are they fishing, and that's just for fishing, not all the other industries that use the water as well. So in order to know who's fishing, once you do know who's fishing, who's watching who's fishing is another question that you have to ask yourself too. A lot of questions, I'm going to get to some answers. But in order to have effective conservation, you need to have an effective understanding of not only who's fishing, but who is watching the folks actually out on the water, because they're out there miles offshore nobody can really see them without good management practices in place that we're going to talk about. So case study for tuna. ISSF, the organization I work with, is solely dedicated to tuna, and we're a partnership with WWF, but also industry and leading scientists. And our goal is sustainable tuna fisheries around the world, 100%. And tuna is a pretty hot commodity, the industry itself is worth anywhere from $7.5 billion to upwards of $12 billion, depending on how you calculate that. And like Michele said, that's probably a very, very low estimate of the overall value of it. Tuna is managed by 5 regional management bodies. Just consider these little mini UNs. They're basically groups of governments that come together to collectively manage these stocks, since they don't belong to anybody. So think of having to influence 5 mini UNs to take even the simplest of steps to improve something like transparency. It takes a lot of effort, and you really need to start at the very beginning. 4.4 million metric tons of tuna fished each year. So you really have to begin with the basics in order to evolve the transparency of a supply chain for something like tuna fish. So observer coverage would seem like a basic, right? You need to know who is out there fishing, and you want to know exactly what they're doing when they're out there fishing. But observer coverage actually is, a third or fourth step. There are things that come before observer coverage. And again, remember, this is under the theme that simple steps matter, right? So there are very simple, basic things that can be done in order to improve the transparency. So observer coverage is something that we all want, but how do we get there? There's something called UVIs, IMO numbers. You're on the Hill, so you know acronyms about as good as the conservation community does. I mean, I'm from ISSF here with ICCF and WWF in DC. So there are lots of acronyms out there, but UVI, IMO numbers, those are basically the VIN number for a vessel, right? You have a VIN number for your car. Well, imagine, the government of Maryland, the government of Virginia, or DC trying to put together a database of all the cars in their jurisdiction without those cars having a unique identification number. It would be impossible to do. You just can't have a list of those cars if you don't have something to track them by. So that's the same for fishing vessels. You need to have an identifier that's attached to that vessel, so they can't go and get a flag of convenience every time they get in trouble. They can't just slap a new name on the back of the boat, put up a new flag, and all of a sudden they're a new vessel. You need to have a number that is with them permanently throughout, from building to scrap, in order to make sure that they can't go below the radar. And then once you have that UVI, that VIN number for the vessel, you can then have a comprehensive record of vessels. So you can know all of the vessels that are out there, and if it's not in your record, then it's not a legal vessel. That allows you to track vessels from region to region. So when they get in trouble in one region, remember there's 5 different regions that are being managed for tuna stocks, 23 tuna stocks in 5 different regions. If a vessel gets in trouble in one region, if it has a unique vessel identifier and there's a comprehensive record of vessels, they can't just go to another region and throw up another flag and get a new name and then start their bad practices in that ocean region. If they do that, they can hop around from region to region for, infinity, basically, the life of the boat or the skipper. And so once you're able to track vessels, then you're actually able to get that observer coverage that we were talking about before that is going to increase the transparency on board a vessel. Not perfectly, because observer coverage on board vessels, that's a human being who is there with a crew whose livelihoods depend on the fishing that is happening there. So there can be some, human intervention into the process, which may make it not as transparent as one would like. But ultimately the goal is to eliminate IUU fishing. So bycatch, it's like we're on Sesame Street. This is actually the word bycatch. And I throw this out here because we're talking about sustainability. One of the issues impacting sustainability, no matter what the fishery is, and impacting the oceans as a whole, the greater marine ecosystem, is bycatch. It's all of that stuff that the fishers catch, that they didn't intend to catch. And of course, it's one of those issues that conservation groups like WWF, groups like ours, and obviously people who are passionate about conservation of the oceans, they want to get a grasp on. They want to reduce bycatch. They want to eliminate it, or at least use the catch to improve food security in some island developing countries. Well, you can't address bycatch if you first don't know what vessels are out there and how they're operating, and you don't have an observer on board. So just to go through this really quickly, I guess you have to actually point it. I went too quickly. Even reducing bycatch requires increased transparency, and here is exactly how it does require that. It kind of comes with a higher level of onboard reporting of all the data, reporting not only from the observer coverage, but from the vessel. So first you have to clear all of those hurdles, and then once you have observer coverage on board, you can begin thinking about things like electronic monitoring, right? So you can begin thinking about having, tracking of these vessels that's much harder to manipulate, that's much harder to skirt around the system. So you have cameras on board watching exactly what's happening. The people who are watching this video are sitting in an office, they're not with the crew, so when they see a shark being caught or a shark being killed or a turtle being caught, they can actually report that data. But in order to get here, you really have to go through all of those steps prior to that. So again, with my message of simple steps actually can make a significant difference. And you can also make a difference when you have industry support. The group that I work with, ISSF, we have the support of the tuna processing, canned tuna, for lack of a better word, the canned tuna industry. If you have a can of tuna in your cupboard at home, chances are better than 75% that it came from a company that works with us towards our goals of doing things like increasing transparency. And just to give you an idea of how the market forces can impact good governance and good regulation, one of the things that we require of our partners in industry is that in order for them to do business with this vessel offloading fish right here, this vessel has to have that first building block of a unique vessel identifier. Otherwise, it won't even make it to the processing plant. It's a prerequisite. Now, in some ocean regions, having an IMO number or having UVI, that is the regulation. But for the market to say, we won't even consider doing business with you unless you first have helped build that first block of this tower that we know is going to increase transparency, that can be a very valuable tool. Because then, again, remember, it's ultimately the lawmakers of all these different countries that are going to come together and build the regulations for the industry. And if you have support from industry at the very bottom, it's much easier to work your way up to the top. And again, my 2 points, really, because there's a lot to understand here, let alone the acronyms, there's just no sustainability of any of the ocean resources, whether it be for shipping, whether it be for fishing, whether it be for any other industry that's using the ocean environment. There's no sustainability without transparency, and you really have to begin with the basics. So my, my final thought is that there is really no step that is too simple that should be discounted. A lot of people go for the highest bar. They want to think, what is my end goal? My end goal is to reduce bycatch. So they just go out there and say, I want to eliminate bycatch. Well, have you first made sure that you even know which vessels you're trying to eliminate bycatch from? And it's just really thinking about those basic steps, things that you think might be there, because in other aspects of life, like at the DMV or the Department of Motor Vehicles, whatever it's called, wherever you're from, you need to have those very basic building blocks in order to do better, make improvements, and ultimately eliminate IUU.
Question for Michele. Michele, the Senate's about to mark up 2 pirate fishing or IUU bills this afternoon. Interesting coincidence. But so the question is, and maybe it's really for both of you, I'm sorry, is there a lot of industry support for these 2 IUU bills in the Senate and 1 in the House? Or if not, why not? It seems like, I'm not trying to put anybody on the spot here, I'm just wondering, I don't know, this is not a rhetorical question. I just don't know whether there's much industry support for these 2 bills, which are fairly modest in aims.
Since you're the industry guy, you go first.
technically the lawyers would like me to tell you that I'm not the industry guy. I work with industry. But no, I think there is support for it. Whether or not you hear that support as loud as you do on some other issues, I think is another thing. I also think that in terms of coordination, I think there are certain groups that do coordination. I do know, I'm not sure what bills are being marked up, but I know that at least my president has written in support of 2 bills that are being marked up, and I know that the National Fisheries Institute, I believe, too, the trade group, has supported those bills as well. I would say that it's fair to say that the seafood industry, particularly, having worked with them, they know these issues are there and not going away, and they'd rather be part of the solution going forward. And so I think that there's quite a bit of support out there. Whether they do a good enough job of letting you know that there is support out there, I'm not sure. Wouldn't really be for me to say. But I would say that at least with the industry that we work with in the tuna side, there's very, very strong support for advancing anything that would help eliminate IUU.
Yeah, I think there's an awful lot of responsible industry that exists, but just like we were talking about, the supply chains are really complicated. And so a lot of the fish that's moving around is not originating in the United States. It's originating elsewhere through oftentimes very complicated chains of supply. Sometimes those are pretty well monitored for proprietary purposes, not necessarily for always weeding out back to the source. Did they come from a place where everybody had authorization, it was all well checked out? Oftentimes there are distracting issues. I mean, and some of those are very legitimate health concerns, safety concerns. Are these, products handled appropriately? Very, very important. So I think that there is a lot of support, and I think exactly like Mike said, the trends are pretty clear, and not only here. I mean, around the world, this is certainly the case. 2008, huge controversy with a new regulation that came out in Europe. And supposedly that was going to close European markets to all illegal fisheries. When I was sitting in Rome, I cannot tell you how many panicked phone calls I got from governments of developing countries that were big fish producers saying, oh my God, what are we gonna do January 1st, 2010, we're not ready. How do we get over this? So the power of the marketplace is incredible. Has it been fully engaged yet? I'd say no. I'd say just in my 30 years doing this, I've seen a huge shift in attitude. So I think all of this is, if now is not the moment, it's very close at hand.